Hello and welcome to the second installment of Ask the Expert. Today I'm joined by Aaron Pearlman, Principal UX Designer here at DQ. Welcome, Aaron. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, first off, I'd like to know a little bit more about your background. How did you get into the accessibility field?
So I should probably just wind it back a little bit and how I got into UX, which led me to accessibility. I got my master's in HCI, which stands for Human Computer Interaction, from the University of Michigan in 2008. And after that, I worked for a company called Blackbaud down in South Carolina as a UX designer for around 7 years or so. And then when my wife and I were expecting, we ended up moving back up to Michigan and connections and to meet Dylan. And he was looking for a user experience designer with enough experience to come in and create a design discipline at DQ. And as for accessibility, that was learned largely kind of on the job here at DQ, learning from all the experts and expertise that we had on hand. Certainly going through the courses at DQ University certainly helped, but my day-to-day interactions with people who are some of the best in the world at accessibility is largely where I got a lot of my accessibility experience.
Wonderful. It's always interesting to see how people end up in the accessibility field, the many different routes you can take and angles that you can approach it. So as somebody who doesn't know much about UX design, and I'll be the first to admit that I don't know that much about the UX design field, I think people tend to think of it of lots of post-it notes and drawings and wireframes, but I'm sure that doesn't even scratch the surface. So can you tell me a little bit more about the UX design field as a whole and what kinds of projects you're involved in your day-to-day?
Sure. Yeah. It's funny because the actual prototyping process and ideation process is a very important part of what UX designers do, but it is only a very it's only a portion of what we spend a lot of our time on. I like to think of user experience designers more as problem solvers in trying to understand what a user's goal is. And in order to tease that information out, we use a series of different types of research techniques, some happening during the ideation or what we like to call the discovery process, and some that will happen throughout the life cycle of a product. So while it's in production, in post-production, when we're readying a new release and things like that, and there's a lot of research that goes on. We also do other things called vision typing, for example, where we'll come up with sort of a pie in the sky idea of a direction that we could potentially go in. And while the design may look polished and have a real high fidelity, it's never actually used in any product at all. It's really just there to set a beacon to get a bunch of stakeholders together to understand one way we could approach a problem in the future. There's lots of other things that we do, but those are just a few of the things that kind of make up what the UX discipline is, in addition to being responsible for things like your fonts and your colors and things like that. And I think it's probably a pretty good transition to talk a little bit about what I do on a day-to-day basis. I can probably split it up best with what I do tactically and what I do strategically. So tactically, I spend a lot of time designing. I spend a lot of time in different types of design software and working with the three teams that I'm currently on, that I'm the lead designer for, doing things sort of at a product level. And there are other teams that I'm do things at an advisory level, meaning that I may not be doing the actual design itself, but I'll be overseeing the design that is done and giving feedback and recommendations as to the best way to make any remedies that may need to happen for the design. At a strategic level, I oversee kind of all major design and research decisions that are made at DQ at a product level. This can kind of include anything from growing and refining our pattern library to doing those things like I mentioned, vision typing in the future. But I also have input in other things, sometimes even marketing efforts that happen. Anything that involves a user's story or journey will likely show up in my wheelhouse at some point or another. So I hope that gives a reasonable overlay of kind of what I'm responsible for.
Awesome. What do you think are some of the most common challenges that UX designers encounter when they're first practicing accessibility?
So I think there's probably a couple things that come to mind when I think about some common challenges that UX designers tend to come across when they're starting accessibility or trying to incorporate accessibility as part of the practice. Um, First of all, it can just feel daunting. There's a lot of stuff that you have to consider as a UX designer when trying to practice accessibility. For example, uh, headings and color contrast certainly come to mind, and I think that those are probably the most readily available ones that people can understand. But there's a whole lot of other things that can fall under UX, like focus management, page structure, accessible names, how you use your live regions, sometimes even ARIA roles, depending on how you and your developers like to pass over information to each other. So those can feel daunting, and certainly trying to incorporate them into your compositions, into your prototyping, can be challenging because you're not quite sure where to start. So that would be kind of one of the first ones that I would say would be one that I think that a lot of UX designers will encounter and maybe feel overwhelmed with. And then another one that I've seen, even talking with other user experience designers out in the field outside of even DQ, is getting an understanding of rules versus best practices, when you should use something, when you shouldn't use something. Can I solve a problem this way, or is it really really strict on how I'm supposed to be able to solve it? And sometimes when they're reading over different types of rules, or reading over WCAG, or reading over best practices, they're not quite sure the application with their specific context in mind, because there isn't always a lot of great accessible examples out there. I remember when the lead developer, Herr Schneiderman, and I at DQ were putting together the assets that we needed for our pattern library Cauldron that we have today. We didn't have a lot of great accessible examples on how to do certain things. And so we had to interpret and justify a lot of different ways to handle certain aspects of our design components, and then just sort of learn and iterate from there. Um, but I guess the way I like to think about it is, rather than thinking about designing accessibly as the same way you would judge a 100-meter dash, where you've got a camera at the end that takes a picture and can tell you exactly who won and who lost. I think of it more of judging a diving competition, for example, where you have a series of different judges, and there's definitely ways that you shouldn't dive, which is just a cannonball into the pool. So clearly there's something wrong with that. An example of that would be if there's an image, and it's an image that is a meaningful image on your page, and you didn't put alt text on it. Clearly that's a violation. That's something that you need to do and you need to provide. But there are other things you can dive and do well, and the judges can all kind of give slightly different scores, and that's okay, because there could be some wiggle room and some interpretation in that. An example of this might be focusing an entire modal when it's evoked versus just focusing the header. Depending on the context, one may be more accessible or more usable than the other. It really just depends. So that's some of those things that I think can just come with experience of designing and integrating accessibility into your designs, but certainly can feel a little bit unnerving and daunting at first, because sometimes the answer is it depends.
Right. And I love that analogy of the 100-meter dash versus a diving contest, that it's not black and white.
Absolutely, and it's understandable too, especially when it's a discipline that or it's a skill set that you're trying to integrate into it. You're looking for rules. You're looking for things that you can follow to make it as clear cut and understandable as possible. But like any UX designer from who's been doing this for a while, Usability is the same thing. There's a lot of ways to make a different system usable. There's a lot of ways to solve the same problem in different, unique, and novel ways. And sometimes those solutions are equally good in many ways. It just depends really on what your user base is used to. It depends on the philosophy of design at your company. It depends on the personal preference of the designers that are there. You may not know this, but a lot of designers imprint their own impressions into the designs themselves, just as you would see in any other type of industry. When anyone personally works on it, you tend to get their philosophy and approach to it. So it's just going to depend on a lot of things, and accessibility is no exception.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely requires a lot of critical thinking. And I think you're absolutely right in saying that we as humans, we imprint our own philosophies, maybe without even knowing it. I think most of the time without even knowing it. And it does take a lot of practice and often a lot of times stepping back to think about who that user is, because they might not be the same as you and they might not have the same perspective that you do.
Absolutely. And it's, just like getting your designs reviewed and having other individuals bounce ideas off of you and iterating and learning over time. I mean, those are all things that are going to happen both with the discipline in usability and accessibility as well, which is, I kind of am using them a little bit interchangeably because accessibility is part of the usability discipline. So if you make something usable, you're in turn making that accessible, and vice versa. So, if I'm using them interchangeably, that is somewhat intentional.
So, what do you think are the most important best practices for someone to remember when they are trying to design an accessible, usable user experience?
So, with regard to best practices for designing accessibly, the same types of things that you employ as a UX practitioner designing usably are going to serve you for designing accessibly. So, beginning to think about accessibility early on in your ideation, which is something that you're already doing now with regard to usability, when you start sketching things out, when you're doing mental models, when you're doing affinity diagrams, when you're using all of those different research techniques, doing contextual inquiry, and so on. You're probably thinking about a lot of different usability things, even if it's sort of implicit in your design process. Considering accessibility as well, and thinking critically about that at first will make it become more and more natural. So thinking about page flow and semantically how things are going to be presented, and thinking about, oh, if somebody who is using a screen reader were to go through this sketch that I have here, what are some considerations that I would want to have in place for that even early on as a good exercise to do so. Color contrasts and headings are always an easy ones to start with if you're looking for just something to get started with. There's a lot of tools out there that can help you check your color contrast, and headings are relatively succinct and straightforward hierarchical structure that is pretty easy for designers to get started in understanding, and can it kind of be a nice segue into having accessibility be part of your discipline. Um, and just as design systems and pattern libraries pay dividends usably, they also pay it accessibly as well. If your design system or if your pattern library or component library is accessible, then you don't have to think about that thing again, and that's great. So that's another thing to as a good best practice is you may want to tackle some of your more strategic assets that you have in place, because once you employ those things outward, you're going to not have to revisit them and wonder, oh, is this modal accessible once I open it up, or is this select list accessible? Oh no, we designed it to be accessible in the pattern library, so I know that when I use it, assuming that it's used properly, it will in turn also be accessible. And I think the last thing maybe just to touch on is it's okay to make a bunch of mistakes when you start. I made a ton of mistakes when I started at DQ, and I still make mistakes today. what's important is just to think critically about them and how to achieve your kind of your user's goals. And you may end up solving a specific problem in a different way rather than trying to brute force the design to solve a specific accessibility issue. You may find a way to design it so that that issue just would never occur. And that the same is true for usability. Sometimes we're like, oh, we have this thing, and then this progressive disclosure opens, and then there's the secondary information, and it's in here. And the problem is people are missing it each time. What ends up being what you do is you just end up redesigning the space in which the evocation of that progressive disclosure and the finding of that particular piece of functionality isn't a problem anymore because it's been brought to the forefront and that space has been rethought. The same can be done to solve accessibility issues as well.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder too that accessibility is always a practice. Everything that we do is always a practice. It's never perfect. And there's always room for improvement and problem solving. And odds are, if you get stuck trying to solve a problem, in the process, you might find ways to solve the problem in a different way that you weren't even considering in the first place.
Certainly, and it's something that I think that UX designers will naturally be looking for. When we talk about, iterations, we tend to have lots of different ways, different approaches to solve the same kind of problem. Um, but when you begin to incorporate accessibility into that, that still is true. And as your knowledge of accessibility grows, and as you understand what things are, you got to have an alt text on it, and which things have a little bit more wiggle room because there's different ways to interpret it. It will also open you up to different ways to solve the same problem. And I think that it's that part, how to iterate and create different ideations usably, is very much in a UX practitioner's wheelhouse. If they're not as familiar with accessibility, it can feel very daunting because it feels like a bunch of very strict rules. And there are a lot of rules there, but there's also a lot of space to work inside of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the process of doing like a math problem. It's a lot less black and white than that.
Yeah, we always say that there's UX. It's a science and an art to it. So there's a lot of empirical things where we go and do a lot of different research, and we get an understanding, and we gather a lot of data, and we talk to users, and we get a lot of feedback, and we go through a very specific design process. But the actual nuts and bolts of designing itself has an art to it.
Absolutely. And it definitely seems like UX design is constantly innovative because of the nature that it's partially scientific and partially an art form. Now, Aaron, you referenced this a little bit earlier, that accessibility can, on one hand, feel very daunting for a UX designer to start to tackle. But on the other hand, it can be this natural extension of the way that a UX designer already works and already thinks. So what in your practice have you seen work for UX designers to get their teams to start focusing more on that accessibility piece?
So you're absolutely right in that UX designers are sort of naturally empathetic towards users, and therefore trying to convince a UX designer that they should design accessibly is not going to take more than about a 2-minute conversation. I don't think I've ever met a UX designer that didn't think that accessibility wasn't important, and didn't think that accessibility wasn't also a responsibility of their discipline as well. But it also will fall on their shoulders to sometimes be an evangelist for accessibility in their company and amongst their teams, potentially, depending on their role and depending on where they have pull. But I found to be a successful evangelist will be a combination of what I call kind of a carrot and a stick. So the carrot side of it can be things like, we want to be more inclusive. It's a competitive advantage to be accessible. It's the right thing to do. It's a valuable skill set to learn. It's a valuable skill set to know. It makes you more marketable as a practitioner in whatever discipline you are. Those are all carrots. And to some people, to some individuals, that's very appealing. And that's kind of the pieces that they need. As for the sticks, they tend to be things like we open ourselves to potential litigation for not being accessible, or our competitors use our lack of accessibility as a differentiator, or it just makes us look bad to our user base that we don't seem to care about accessibility. Um, it, I think it'll be up to each individual at their organization, each UX individual at their organization, or whomever wants to champion accessibility, to know which of those combinations need to be employed on whom. But it tends to be that carrot approaches tend to work a lot amongst team members and other single contributors, and the more stick-like approaches tend to work more in the management area. That's not always true, of course, but it's not so much a, I guess carrot and stick is reasonable, but it's just more demonstrating the importance of accessibility and how it's extremely beneficial for a company to consider their applications to become accessible. And it's also important for the protection of the company to demonstrate that you're accessible in many respects as well. So it has kind of a, there's lots of different ways to evangelize the need for accessibility and to be accessible and to create an accessibility discipline inside your company. But certainly finding ways to circulate results of your current state of affairs is always a great way to get started. So for example, downloading our free automatic scan engine Axe and showing people results is a great way to say, hey, this is kind of where we're at today. And it's not the most comprehensive, deepest understanding of the state of affairs accessibly. You would need a lot of other means and mechanisms to do that, but it certainly is a good way to just do a gut check and say, hey, we have a lot of violations just on our homepage alone. It's probably something that maybe we should pay attention to for, whatever myriad of reasons that I just gave.
Right, absolutely. And I can definitely see how a UX designer who is intrinsically motivated by the humans and the users behind their designs would be notably upset at seeing results and issues in a web page that effectively prevents users from using it. I imagine that would be a good motivator to start thinking about some of those prohibiting elements from using his design.
Yeah, and it certainly is, and also for many developers and QA as well, because you don't know what you don't know, and then all of a sudden, when you see it from a user experience standpoint, you look at this and you say, oh my, all of these users can't use these things. These are critical issues that are keeping some of my user base from even being able to perform the most mundane tasks on my application. Yeah, that doesn't sit well with me for a developer. These all look like bugs to me, and I don't like bugs at a core way. But certainly, there's going to be a lot of empathy there as well. They don't like the fact that their users are unable to use the application as intended. QA can have the same kind of feeling, and there can be a combination of those feelings amongst the different members that make up your development team. So absolutely, you're going to kind of have that initial feeling when you see it, but it's okay because it's just an opportunity. It's an opportunity to improve, and it's really just there as a way to think about how you can not only make your application better, but how you can procedurally address some of those things in a more sustainable way so that you don't come across them again and again and again.
So, Aaron, you mentioned a couple of examples earlier on in our conversation of best practices that UX designers who are wanting to practice accessibility but might not be practicing it currently can take away from our conversation. One of those being color contrast. Do you have any other takeaways that somebody could, after listening to our conversation, go and do right now?
Sure. So there's a pretty nice little exercise that any designer can do with literally any comp that they have or any existing software that they have worked on or that is part of the wheelhouse of responsibilities that they have, or just any design at all. And that is, if I couldn't see anything on this page, what information would need to be presented to me, when and how, in order to successfully navigate it to achieve the desired end state? That's pretty much it. So if you weren't able to see anything that's on your page, how would you navigate it? How would you tab cycle through it? And maybe that might lead you to begin to tab through your application as one means, or arrow through, depending on how it's built. And is it going in the order that you would expect it to? Is it going through the same order that a sighted user would go through it? Am I being if I were to use a screen reader on it, would I be given back the types of information that would be necessary in order to understand what this button does and where it goes, or where this link goes? If I couldn't see this thing here, this interactive element here, would I know what it did when we call landed on it, when I focused to it? Would I know what the expectation was? Was enough context given to me? I think that's a really valuable exercise just to get started and starting to think critically about accessibility and how to work through some of those problems. Just take your time through it, and you don't have to get absolutely every possible thing, but even that exercise alone, even in maybe just a pattern or a component that you're working on, is a valuable one. And you'll find yourself doing that more and more and more, and you'll just get better and better and better at it as your knowledge of accessibility grows.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you described really is a great exercise in empathy, in perspective taking, in putting ourselves in another person's shoes as we're designing for them, as we're writing for them. It becomes second nature after a while, after you continue to do it and embed it into your practice.
Definitely. UX designers already do this when we design our hero flows, as some people like to call them, or the core, or I call the spine of the system, the core flows that represent the main tasks that most people do when going through a certain part of an application or a system. We go through that dozens and dozens of times, thinking through critically on how a user would perceive certain parts of things, what kind of affordance they have provided to them. Now, do the same thing. If you couldn't see anything on the page, it becomes a little bit different, but it is an exercise that we already do and already employ, and it just once you switch the lens that you do it through, can be very illuminating.
Fantastic. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining today. It was awesome talking to you and hearing your insights and getting a small glimpse into the world, the dynamic world of UX design. Very much appreciate you taking the time to sit and chat with us and share some of your expertise.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, if you have any questions for Aaron, please get in touch with me. You can email me at grace.kirkley, that's GRACE .KIRKLEY @dq.com. Thanks so much and hope you enjoyed.